the Hebrews created history as we know it.
You don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant and violate your conscience without cost. You will pay the piper. It's going to call you out of that slavery into freedom, even if that pulls you into the desert.
And we're going to see that there's something else going on here that is far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
The highest ethical spirit to which we're beholden is presented precisely as that spirit that allies itself with the cause of freedom against tyranny. And
yes, exactly. I want villains to get punished.
But do you want the villains to learn before they have to pay the ultimate price?
That's such a Christian question.
When I first heard the argument that it might have come from a lab, I said, no, we're not nearly clever enough to design a virus this good. Well, once I found out what we were doing, or what they were doing, I was really shocked by how far into the manipulation and testing of dangerous viruses we have gone in the last 10 years.
I'm trying to understand why there would be motivation to shut down, let's say, speculation, investigation into the possibility of a lab leak. And I guess maybe part of the reason is that it reveals a reality that in some sense is too dreadful to conveniently comprehend. It'd be easier in some sense in the short term just to stick our heads in the sand and pretend it isn't happening. But we also have another problem, which is, while the Chinese are pretty damn authoritarian and they're still run by the Communist Party, which is a dreadful organization, we don't know how much our entanglement with the Chinese tilts us towards that totalitarian structure. And so when the pandemic emerged, the totalitarians acted first, and they acted in a totalitarian way, which is, well, why don't we just lock everyone down? Which is sort of the totalitarian answer to everything. And then in our herd-like panic in the West, we immediately imitated them. That's the spread of a pathogen too, right? We have a pathogen of COVID to contend with, but we also have a pathogen of totalitarianism to contend with. And I would say the latter poses a much bigger threat than the former, unless we keep mucking about with gain-of-function research. Hello, everyone. I'm happy today to be speaking with Dr. Matt Ridley, one of the world's most well-known and lucidly minded rationalists. I've spoken with Matt before on my podcast, and we're going to talk today about, among other things, about the origin of the COVID virus. So that should be entertaining. Matt Ridley is a British writer, journalist, and public speaker. He has a BA and DPhil degree from Oxford University. Matt also worked for The Economist for 9 years as science editor. He worked as a Washington correspondent and American editor as well, before becoming a self-employed writer and businessman. Matt writes a weekly column in The Times of London and also writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. As Viscount Ridley, he was elected to the House of Lords in February 2013 and served on the Science and Technology Select Committee from 2014 to 2017. He won the Hayek Prize in 2011, the Julian Simon Award in 2012, and the Free Enterprise Award from the Institute of Economic Affairs in 2014. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is honorary president of the International Center for Life in Newcastle. Matt also holds honorary doctorates from Buckingham University, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and University Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. His books have sold over 1 million copies, been translated into 31 languages, and have won several awards. His books include The Red Queen, The Origins of Virtue, Genome, nature via nurture. Francis Crick, the rational optimist, the evolution of everything, how innovation works. And the revised and expanded version of his latest book, Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, we're going to talk about a variety of issues, including, not least, the politicization of science and perhaps the politicization of everything. But I think maybe we'll start by walking through your book on the origin of COVID-19. And so the first thing I'm curious about, I suppose, is why did you decide to investigate the origin of COVID-19? Why didn't you?
I recently joined forces with the Daily Wire. The plan is to build a multimedia empire offering services on the philosophical, educational, journalistic, and entertainment front, and an empire that will not fall prey to the woke authoritarianism that has become increasingly mandatory in so many places, including, let's say, the once great Disney. Daily Wire Plus has 890,000 subscribers. Netflix has 200 million. DW Plus is not woke. Is Netflix? Decide that for yourself, but give some consideration to supporting this new joint venture and help us continue educating and informing and battling on the side of tradition in the raging culture war.
Was ist das Wichtigste, wenn man abnehmen möchte? Ich habe hier ein paar verschiedene Faktoren. Ich kann schon mal sagen, Disziplin ist nicht das Wichtigste. Man kann abnehmen komplett ohne Disziplin zu haben. Und man muss dafür auch keinen Sport und keine Diäten machen. Immer wieder erzählt ein Personal Trainer, man muss laufen gehen, man muss ins Fitnessstudio gehen. Das ist absoluter Quatsch. Ich bin studierter Ernährungsberater, weiß genau, wie der Körper funktioniert und erkläre gleich, wie es wirklich geht. Was kann man noch machen? Ganz viele denken, es ist die Genetik und sagen, ich kann einfach nicht abnehmen. Ist Quatsch. Jeder Mensch kann abnehmen. Was bleibt übrig? Tatsächlich ist der Schlaf ganz entscheidend, denn der Schlaf sorgt dafür, dass unsere Hormone in Balance sind und unser Stoffwechsel schnell oder langsam ist. Wir spüren das auch, wenn wir mal eine durchzechte Nacht hatten, dann weiß jeder, wie man sich am nächsten Tag fühlt, miserabel. Schon wenn man eine Nacht mit zu wenig Schlaf hatte, friert man mehr, weil der Körper Kalorien spart, hat mehr Heißhungerattacken, bewegt sich weniger, also der Körper macht alles, um wenig Fett zu verbrennen und viel Fett zu behalten. Es gibt aber noch einen Faktor, den kennen die wenigsten und das ist die Stoffwechselrate, die bei den meisten Menschen im Schlaf absolut in den Keller fällt. Gerade wenn man nachts vielleicht friert, eine dicke Decke braucht, dann weiß man, hey, der Körper spart bei mir nachts Kalorien. Es gibt aber ein einfaches Ritual, das kann man direkt vor dem Zubettgehen machen, wo man ein paar spezielle Nährstoffe vorm Schlafen isst, die die Hormone so ausgleichen, dass man auch beim Schlafen einen feurigen, schnellen Stoffwechsel hat, der schön aktiv ist. Und das sorgt dafür, dass die Regeneration im Körper angeregt wird, der Körper Fett dafür verbrennt und man sich am nächsten Tag wach, erholt, frisch fühlt und vor allem auf der Waage leichter ist. Egal was man isst, egal ob man Sport macht oder nicht, man nimmt automatisch im Schlaf ab. Und wie das funktioniert, da habe ich einfach mal eine kostenlose Videopräsentation aufgenommen. Da zeige ich Schritt für Schritt, wie der Schlaf funktioniert und welche Nährstoffe man in welcher Menge vor dem Schlafen essen muss, damit es einen guten Effekt hat. Also, man muss keine E-Mail-Adresse oder so eintragen, einfach auf den Button in oder unter dem Video hier klicken, die Gratispräsentation angucken, die neue Abendroutine umsetzen und dann viel Spaß auf der Waage.
Why didn't you just accept the idea that it emerged in the exotic meat market and in Wuhan and like a good boy, let's say, and leave it at that?
It's a good question. And the answer is, to start with, I did accept the conventional version. But I was interested, I'm a zoologist by background, and I was interested in how these diseases jump. And I thought it was highly likely this one had jumped like SARS did from a bat through the food chain. But I wanted to know where and when and how. And I knew that the scientists in Wuhan had an idea about a similar virus. So I got the Wall Street Journal to commission an article from me called The Bats Behind the Pandemic. What was it about horseshoe bats that was harboring such viruses? How were people coming into contact with them? What did we know? What was the story in this case? It was a very interesting story in the case of SARS in 2003 to do with food markets near Hong Kong. What was going to be the story in this case? And in investigating it, I came upon anomalies like the fact that this virus was not particularly closely related to the bat one they had, like they couldn't tell me where they found the bat one. The paper that I read didn't give the location, and the name of the virus, the bat virus, was one that didn't appear in the scientific literature, and yet they said they'd found it previously. So I was rather puzzled by all this, and I called up a number of virologists, and they said, well, yes, there's some anomalies here we don't understand, but it's nothing to do with a lab leak. You can rule that out. Now, I believed that for about 2.5 months. And then I came across the work of Alina Chan, who eventually became my co-author on this book. And she was saying, actually, we can't rule out a lab leak. There's quite a lot of things about this story that make it really quite plausible that what's happened here is an escape from a lab, because we're dealing with a virus that turns up in the city, which has the lab that does work on SARS-like coronaviruses more than any other lab in the world. And that geographical coincidence has to be taken seriously, particularly when we find that the virus from the bat that they identified as being closely related to SARS-CoV-2 had been found effectively in their own freezer. And that's a starting point for a query. So by the middle of May 2020, the Chinese were announcing they didn't think it started in that market. Alina Chan was saying there's lots of evidence to suggest this thing is well adapted to human beings. And the geographical coincidence all got me interested in this being an open question, not a closed one, and one that needed further investigation. And the deeper I dug, the more emerged.
Okay, so let me summarize that. So the first smoking pistol, in some sense, as you point out, is the coincidence of the location of this lab, which studies exactly this kind of virus, and the outbreak itself. And that's a problem, right? So that means that it's reasonable to look at that and think that, well, it could have escaped from a lab there. That's the first conclusion. And that it has to be demonstrated in some sense that it didn't. And then, so that's a problem. And I can't see how that's anything but an incontrovertible problem. The mere fact that that lab is there and that it does research on those types of viruses and that that's where the outbreak was doesn't prove that it originated in the lab, but it certainly makes that a plausible hypothesis. But then you add this additional twist, which is, I think, more complicated for people to understand, and you detail this out, you provide some detail for this in the book, that this virus is somewhat remarkably well adapted to human beings. Now, there are literally trillions and trillions of different forms of viruses. And so obviously most of them aren't particularly well adapted to human beings, because otherwise we would have trillions of viruses producing pandemics through all the time. So it's generally the case that viruses are not well adapted to transmission in human beings, and that's true for the overwhelming majority of viruses. And so the fact of this human adaptation, or adaptation to human transmission, is something of signal importance. And so maybe you could walk me and everyone else listening through why a typical virus isn't adapted to human transmission and what it means that one is and how that develops.
Yes. The normal pattern when a virus first emerges into the human species is for it to be very difficult for the virus to spread human to human. It can infect someone, it can even possibly kill someone, but they're not very good at passing it on to people. The virus is not really very good at transmitting between members of this new host. Now, if enough time goes by with enough infections happening, then eventually it will get good at it. And that's what was starting to happen with SARS in 2003. It first infected people in the fall of 2002. By the spring of 2003, you were starting to see chains of transmission from person to person. And the reason for this is that the virus has to evolve. It has to change its genetic code in such a way that it can better fit the receptors on the cells of humans as opposed to the receptors on the cells of bats, or in the case of SARS, the intermediate host, which was a palm civet.
Will the lack of a red wave during the midterms lead to more reckless spending by a more emboldened administration, higher taxes, deeper inflation? If you're unsure how the next 2 years will unfold, talk to Birch Gold Group about protecting your savings with gold. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert your IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals, so you can own gold and silver in a tax-sheltered account. Here's what you need to do. Text Jordan to 989898 to claim your free info kit on gold. Then talk to one of their precious metal specialists. They will hold your hand through the entire process. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers, and almost 20 years of experience converting IRAs and 401ks into precious metals IRAs, Birch Gold can help you protect your savings too. Text Jordan to 989898 and protect yourself with gold today. That's Jordan to 989898.
So we should point out that the problem of transmission that a virus has to solve is no different from the problem of the virus determining in some sense or evolving so that it can live. Transmission in a virus is the same thing as propagation in the environment. And so this is a very knotty problem, K-N-O-T-T-Y, for a virus to solve. It's not simple at all because it has to not kill the host too quickly. And it has to be able to replicate within an individual, but then it not only does it have to manage those things, which is very difficult, it also has to figure out how to transmit itself with some degree of effectiveness. And thank God most viruses can't solve that problem. So this is a very thorny problem. And maybe you can outline for everyone how viruses do solve that problem and why most don't, and why the fact of human adaptation to humans is so important.
Yeah. So just to give you a good example, bird flu, which is a big problem at the moment in poultry flocks and wild birds, is not very good at infecting human beings. People can catch it. People have even died of it. If you're exposed to a huge dose by working in a poultry farm, you can get sick and you'll probably die, but you probably won't give it to anybody else. We've not seen any human-to-human transmission of that virus. This virus was good at transmitting between human beings from the word go, from the November or December of 2019. And the reason for that, we now know in molecular terms, it has a so-called receptor binding domain on its spike gene, which is well adapted to the human ACE2 receptor on our cells. Not very well adapted to other species receptors, which is intriguing.
So it's a specific human adaptation.
Not specific. It's not completely specific. It's quite good at lots of animals, but it's really good at us. Okay. And the other feature that it has that is very striking and very surprising is that it has something called a furin cleavage site. Now, this is a small section of the spike gene that is coded by about 12 letters of RNA genetic code, which has been inserted into it, compared with all its close relatives. And that gives it the ability to use a human enzyme called furin that is in all our, many of our cells, in order to reconfigure the virus as it leaves a cell to make it, to as it were, prime it to attack another cell. So it's actually using one of our enzymes to spread in the body. This enables it to infect more tissues in the body and to multiply much more effectively. So it's the reason we're having a pandemic, is the furin cleavage site. If this virus didn't have that, it would probably have been pretty easy to control in the early months.
You said something very interesting, and this is another piece of the puzzle, I presume, is that compared to other viruses of its type, it has this interesting furin cleavage site. I've got that right. And you said that it had been inserted, and that's a well, that's an anomalous statement, let's say. So there's something about this particular virus that sets it out against other viruses of its type, and it's this particular ability to use a human enzyme, and you described that as inserted, and so I presume that could be inserted as a consequence, hypothetically, of natural selection processes, or that there's other alternative explanations. So what do you see when you look at that?
What I mean by inserted here is that it's an extra piece of genetic information. We can look at 20 or 30 other very similar viruses, and we can line their genomes up and match them up against this one. And the furin cleavage site is not an altered bit; it's an added bit. It's an extra chunk that's been added in the middle of the spike gene.
So how do you differentiate between added and different? I presume that's a consequence of degree of divergence. So you could imagine that there's a set of viruses that are genetically and evolutionarily similar, so they stem from a similar source, and they have a predictable pattern of variation. And you're saying that this is an anomaly that exists outside that.
Well, you line them up. You align the genetic codes of the viruses, and in this particular part of the spike gene, they all align up quite well. You know, the sequence is mostly the same. You can tell it's been added because you can align the genes of the spike genes of other viruses alongside each other and see that this is an extra piece of RNA, not a changed piece of RNA. It's about 12 letters long, and this spells